All right, happy Wednesday to everyone. We are going to be talking about history today for the Museums from Your Home live stream. I'm just going to give us a look-see here and make sure that we're working properly on all of our different platforms. It looks like we're live on YouTube, so you can watch from youtube.com/UA Museums. So you can go to the UA Museums channel and watch it there. You can also watch it from the Gorgas House Museum's Facebook page, which it looks like we are live there as well. And so I'm just going to go over to the Transportation Museum, make sure that's live and working. Looks like we're good to go. So we are live on all of our platforms, so you can pick whichever one you prefer to watch from. All right, well, I'll get us started and we'll get into today's discussion. Welcome to today's Museums from Your Home live stream presented by the University of Alabama Museums. My name is Rebecca Johnson and I'm the Communication Specialist for UA Museums. And joining me today are Katherine Edge, Director of the Mildred Westervelt Warner Transportation Museum, and Brandon Thompson, Director of the Gorgas House Museum. And Brandon, I see we have a guest with us today. Would you like to introduce him?
I would be happy to. Yes, today we are joined by Dr. John Beeler, who is a professor in the University of Alabama's Department of History. His research interests include the social and cultural history of Victorian Britain, public opinion and defense policy, imperial defense administration, and libertarian fallacies, among a few others. And I'm really looking forward to today's conversation. I think we're going to have a great time with it.
Yeah, that's very exciting, and we'll be getting to that discussion in a minute. Just want to remind everybody that we are live on Facebook and YouTube, so just bear with us in case we have any internet connectivity issues. Sometimes that does happen, but hopefully we'll be smooth sailing this morning. And because we are live, feel free to ask any questions that you might have in the comment section, and we'll get that to our panelists. So I guess now that we've gotten some of all that business out of the way, Brandon, how should we get started today?
Well, yeah, we've got a whole range and list of questions we're going to use to pick Dr. Beeler's brain. We'll see how many we can get to, but if we go off topic, that's totally fine too. I'm really looking forward to it. Dr. Beeler, thank you so much for joining us this morning. I'm happy to have you on.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you. So just to get started, can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to teach at the University of Alabama?
I grew up in Piedmont, North Carolina, basically a faculty brat, if you will. My dad was a professor of history at University of North Carolina, Greensboro. I spent a good deal of my adolescent and post-adolescent life trying to escape that background, which ended up, getting me with a lot of dead-end jobs in the food service industry. And eventually I went back to school, older, somewhat more mature, not necessarily wiser, earned a master's in history and decided I liked what I was doing and decided to run off to University of Illinois and do a PhD. The kind of history I did then, and I still do now to some extent, is very old-fashioned. You could say it's top-down, dead white male, administrative, policy, political, and military history, things that started to go out of fashion almost a century ago in terms of historical research trends. And I think that's a good thing, by the way. But as a consequence, when I came out of the University of Illinois, I tried to market myself as a modern British historian, and nobody who was hiring modern British historians believed that's what I was. They believed I was actually a naval and military historian. And so when the University of Alabama advertised for a naval historian, and this was back in 1993, it was a sort of like, oh, well, I can do that. Required retooling my application letter because I hadn't been applying for any such because they weren't being advertised. So I completely redrafted my application letter, and lo and behold, I ended up with the job, because when you're competing for a modern British history job, you're competing with dozens, if not hundreds, of other candidates. And when you're competing for naval history jobs, you're probably competing with, maybe more than that, but you could certainly count them on all your fingers and toes. And the odds go up accordingly. And I was lucky enough to end up getting the job. And the job market in the early 90s was as dire as the job market is now. And so when you get a tenure track job and the promise of permanence in employment, you grab it, no matter where it might be, which is not to disparage the University of Alabama, but it is to suggest that I'm a wee bit less conservative than Alabama society as a whole. And I will leave it that one at that. You know, do you want to know more?
Let me see how much time we have at the end of this conversation, and then maybe we'll go into it. Yeah, just even that, I could talk to you about North Carolina, because I grew up on the coast, like near New Bern and Oriental and Washington.
Lucky man.
Yeah, it was not bad. Yeah, just being able to walk in the backyard and pick up blue crabs was not a bad teenage childhood. That was.
I would like to be able to do that. The real advantage of Greensboro is that you're very close to Lexington, which is ground zero for real barbecue, as far as I'm concerned.
All right, that is also a hot button topic in this state. Because I've been to my pig pickings and my vinegar-based barbecue, and you come over here and it's completely different. Yeah. You've got coleslaw on the sandwich and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's a little different.
Yeah.
But yeah, we can come back to that too. And then, talking about the food service industry, I'm curious to hear about that, and what your favorite jobs you held in that, what that entire experience and culture is by itself, because that's its own microcosm of culture, which is just fascinating to talk about. Okay, let's see. I might come back to some of those towards the end, because those would be really fun.
I could expound on the food service industry.
Yeah, but I'm going to highlight that. I might come back to it. It looks like a lot of fun.
And I have to be really careful with my choice of words too.
Okay, so I'll try and keep us on topic for the next question, at least the next question anyway. All right, so we touched on a little bit about what your background was and what some of your research interests are. So can you expound upon those a little bit, and what draws you to those topics?
That's a good question, and I don't know entirely. I guess, and this, you'll appreciate this, having grown up on the coast, there was always this landlubber's fascination with the sea and with ships. We as a kid, our parents would go down to Long Beach or Topsail Island 1 week a year, and that was, it's always a high point of the year, and I would stare longingly out to sea, and the occasional freighter would appear on the horizon, and I thought that was mesmerizing, or I found that mesmerizing. And my first semester in grad school, as an MA student, this is way back in 1982 at UNCG. I took a course on modern British history with Professor Ron Castle, just a wonderful human being. And he assigned us a research paper, and I decided, well, I'm fascinated with ships, yada, yada, yada. And the ships of the Royal Navy in the period from about 1850 to almost the end of the 19th century look really bizarre. They were experimenting with armor. They were incorporating steam. They were developing torpedoes, yada, yada, yada. And they had no clue about what the future of naval warfare was going to look like. Did all of these new technologies simply sweep the ocean clean or erase the blackboard? And are we going to have to start over in devising tactics and devising strategies? Are we going to have to figure out naval warfare anew? And as a consequence, without any clues what the future would look like, they came up with some really seemingly bizarre designs. And I was attracted to those bizarre designs because they didn't look like what had preceded them, sailing ships, which had been pretty much the same for a couple of centuries. And they didn't look what came after them, standardized battleships or aircraft carriers. And I wrote a paper, and I was interested mostly in the technology, and I wrote a paper for Ron Castle in which I made the rather, what's the word I'm looking for, immodest claim that since nobody has looked closely at this period, I'm going to do it. And Ron bless his heart, told me politely, diplomatically, that it was a rather immodest claim, but it was correct nonetheless. And I went off to do my dissertation, and I built on that because still nobody had written about it, this period of, the 1860s and 1870s. And I wrote a dissertation about it. But by that point, I was less interested in the ships and far more interested in the thinking of the guys who were requesting and designing these ships, because technology exists as a means to human ends. What did they intend to do? Because if you just look at the ships, you tend to go, oh, they didn't know what the hell they were doing. But if you look at what they were thinking, if you look at their memoranda, it turns out that they're very sensible. They know exactly what they're doing, and they're trying to feel their way through this period in which all of the traditional verities, all of the traditional knowledge seems to have been tossed out the window, and they're having to feel their way through a London fog, as it were. And so the motives of the people who were making naval policy became far more interesting to me than the ships that ended up resulting from the motives of the people who were making naval technology. And that's pretty much what I've done for the last, I wrote that dissertation almost 30 years ago. And so for basically for the last 30 years, that's more or less been what I've been doing. And it's a couple of books on the subject, one dealing with the political and economic background to naval policy, and the other one dealing with the technological aspects of naval policy. And I'm going to follow that up sooner or later and carry the story forward almost to the end of the 19th century. And for the past, 25 years plus, I've been editing the papers of one of those principal policymakers, a guy named Admiral Alexander Milne. I've been editing his professional papers for publication, and in the process of doing that, I started looking at his personal papers, because I was trying to figure out things like, well, how did he get promoted from lieutenant to commander, and so on and so forth. And the answer for those is in the personal papers. And it turns out it was nepotism and patronage which got him promoted from lieutenant to commander. And those personal papers, the family papers and personal papers, were just a gold mine, because you get to see how sausage is made. On the one hand, you get promotion by nepotism and patronage, and who your daddy knows, but also they shed amazing light on the dynamics within the family, on the dynamics between Alexander Milne and his brother, and his father and his stepmother, and eventually his wife and his children. And this was like, kid in a candy shop time for me. And I went, boy, I want to be a social and cultural historian so badly. I'm sick of dealing with top-down, dead white male elite political, administrative, and policy history. This is what I want to do. And, well, that means we're mastering an entirely new secondary literature. This means reading about the dynamics of families in the Victorian era. This means reading about the history of emotions. So I'm sort of like, at this point, changing horses midstream, as it were. And because I hope I know enough about Milne's professional life, it is a fairly easy step for me to take to delve into the personal life, the family life, to some extent into the private life as well. Back when my wife and I were courting, I read her, sorry about that, gender slip up. I read her some of the letters that Alexander Milne wrote to his fiancée, Effie, when they were courting, at the point where they were actually affianced. And she said, "These are wonderful, John. They're absolutely wonderful. They, give lie to this idea that the Victorians were tight-lipped and straight-laced and buttoned down. And these, she says we should make a movie out of this. And she's worked out who should be starring in the movie. And I'm not so sure about that myself. I'm not sure how broadly appealing the story of Alexander and Effie Milne are, but I'm certainly fascinated in it. And I've been going great guns writing their story last summer and this summer. And that's pretty much where I am research-wise.
John, you'd be very, very surprised about exactly how interesting and how mainstream Victorian relationships can be. And I say this because this is one of my favorite movies. And whenever you mentioned Alexander and Effie's letters, I thought, oh, hold on a minute. I think I have something I can contribute to the conversation. There's an absolutely wonderful movie called Possession, and it stars Aaron Eckhart and Jennifer Eel, and they and Gwyneth Paltrow, and it is absolutely fantastic, and it's all centered around. And I could talk for the rest of the hour about how great this movie is, but it centers around letters between two people in the Victorian time period, and Aaron Eckhart's character and Gwyneth Paltrow's character are modern historians and English lit, and they are piecing together what happened between these two people during the Victorian time, and letters play into it, and it's absolutely fantastic. And there's a beautiful parallel between, ultimately relationships are really not that different, because the movie vacillates back and forth between the modern era with Eckhart and Paltrow's characters, and then they go back in time to the Victorian area with Eel's character. And I have to admit, I don't know the gentleman that plays the protagonist in the Victorian time, but it's absolutely gorgeous, and it's such a good movie, and it's exactly about and the aspect that you just talked about, these letters between people during the Victorian age that really showcase they were not as like you said, as straight-laced and tight-lipped as history likes to portray them. That they were really very very in tune with emotions, poetry, botanicals, the whole language of flowers that developed during that time. And it's really interesting. So something along the lines has actually already been done, but I'm all for those kinds of stories. I think that's absolutely fantastic. And everybody that is watching, I don't know where you'll be able to find it in this modern age of Netflix and Hulu and all those other kind of things, because I grew up and go down to Blockbuster and get it from Blockbuster. I'm really dating myself here, but it's called Possession, and it is absolutely fantastic, and I highly recommend everybody watch it because it is absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, and you're touching
on me of that.
You're touching on a lot of things which are common in Alexander's letters to his wife and to his stepmother, particularly how does the garden look? He has an estate in Scotland, a small one by gentry standards. It's not thousands and thousands of acres. It's a modest sized house by their standards, with a few acres around it, enough for a great flower garden and orchard and not much else. And he's in London or elsewhere most of the time, and his stepmother is resident in the house that he owns in Scotland, outside of Edinburgh. And very, very frequently he is asking about the state of the garden or the state of the greenhouses, or have we gotten any fruit from the peach trees of all things? This is southern Scotland, the peach trees that we've got planted along one of the walls so that the wall will absorb the heat if the sun actually happens to come out. This is Scotland after all, and so on and so forth. Yeah. So, and in fact, I'd made a note. I just come across a note in my notes to myself going, the frequency that they mention flowers in the gardens is something that you need to bring up. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a lot of fun. You touched on a couple of concepts really that have an anthropological and archaeological application as well, that you're dealing with these objects and then even these records, if you're doing it from a historian's point of view. And they're really taking these objects and this information and exploring the humanity behind these things, because we
Right.
project our meaning and our purpose onto whatever these objects might happen to be, whether it's a piece of pottery or a projectile point,
Mhm.
up into
Yeah.
these massive ships and how we transform the landscape. And
Mhm.
yeah, I completely agree. I do think we are moving further and further in that way in many different disciplines. And I think is it Alex and Effie or Effie and Alex, that whole project you're
Uh,
working on?
it it started out as Alex and Effie. Her real name is Euphemia, Euphemia, which is a quite common name in Scotland, at least in that period and earlier in the 18th century. But everybody calls her Effie, Effie. It was originally Alex and Effie, and now it's become Effie and Alex because I want to try and foreground her. I know a
So
lot. Unfortunately, for that aim, I know a great deal more about him than I know about her.
I suppose that's understandable given who was writing the records and who was keeping history at the time. So I
Yeah,
suppose that.
and also I started with him, the professional, and he kept an enormous amount of his professional correspondence, not simply memoranda that he wrote, but draft after draft of memoranda he wrote in his beautiful handwriting with words crossed out and new words inserted in. And also, some of this is the luck of survival. He owned that house outside of Edinburgh. His stepmother was resident there, and when she died in 1862, his letters to her didn't get tossed. And so I've got, good grief, I think there are more than 600 letters of him to her. They're not as many of her as her to him because he was transient and a lot of them got lost. He was in London for quite a while. We've got quite a few of those. But then he went to sea in command of the North American West Indies Station from 1860 to 64, which meant that he was either on board a ship or he was in Halifax or he was in Bermuda. And a lot of those letters got lost in transit. Plus, she died in 1862. And so I've got lots of him to her, some of her to him. I've got lots of him to his wife and a lot of hers to him. But those only start really, there's one pre-1850 period. She wrote him this remarkable letter saying, I don't think you take religion seriously enough, in 1845, and his very diplomatic response to her suggesting that she might be a religious enthusiast, and maybe to tamp that down a little bit. Very Victorian. But from 1850 onward, we've got more letters, but then again, they were often in the same place at the same time, and there was absolutely no reason for them to be writing letters to each other when they could just speak.
So who is playing them in the movie?
Am I allowed to say this? She has Harrison Ford penciled in as Alexander Milne, and
Okay.
Nicole Kidman penciled in as Effie Milne.
Oh, nice.
Okay. I can get on board with those choices. All right. Not bad at all. Okay, I'm going to shift gears just for a little bit, and we'll come back to this perspective in a second. But I want to shift gears to start talking about students in just a little bit. Katherine and I, we work with students all the time in our spaces as employees and visitors and researchers. And you've been recognized several times for your teaching. In fact, we were talking about it just a little bit before we got started on the show. Just talking about how passionate you are about the subject matter and how that translates into the experiences of your students too. So what is it about teaching that you're so passionate about? Is it the subject matter? Is it the students' desire to learn? What exactly is it that draws you to teaching?
I think there are a couple of things lurking in the background philosophically, and then one methodologically. Philosophically, I am convinced that an accurate understanding of the past is of considerable utility to us as we contemplate the present, and of equal, if not greater, utility as we try and answer the questions that we need to answer going forward. History doesn't provide us lessons, but it provides us countless examples. And, when we're wrestling with what do we do going forward, we basically have three sources that we can draw on. We can draw on personal experience. That'll only go so far. We can draw on history, and that will take us an infinite range, or we can draw on intuition. I think the third one is stupid. Intuition will get us into all sorts of trouble. Personal experience won't take us all that far, and that leaves history. And so if history is of an accurate understanding of the past is of some utility for us in the present and contemplating the future, then it seems to me that I need to impart that belief in the classroom. And this is not aimed so much at the history majors. It's not aimed so much at the upper level classes. If you're a history major, I assume you share that belief. But I don't get a whole lot of history majors in the entry-level surveys. I teach the entry-level survey, the second half of Western civilization. And I'm not unique in this. The University of Alabama is very good about having senior professors taking charge of the gut level introductory courses. That's considered part of our duty. But the Western Civ 2 class, we don't get a lot of history majors because the history majors have taken the AP test and they've clept out of it and they don't have to take it. So we get accounting majors and engineering majors and the hard sciences and some social sciences and so on and so forth. And that's the target audience. Those are the ones who need convincing that history matters. And my goal is to convince them of that. And I'm not going to get through to all of them because I was an undergraduate once myself, and I was more concerned with, assuming I even showed up for class in the first place, I was more concerned with thinking about where the next keg party on campus was. So
But, an honest answer.
I want to get through to the kids like me as an undergraduate. I wasn't one of those aggressive overachievers as an undergraduate. I was one of the, slackers. I needed to grow up. I was immature. I lacked, there was not a question of smarts, but I lacked the motivation. And I want to get through to those kids. And I remember from my undergraduate experience that if I bothered to go to class, which I often didn't, I would daydream or I would doodle in the margins or I would go, oh my God, when is this going to be over? And I would stare at the clock hoping it would move faster, except of course when it was a really entertaining story. And then I was mesmerized. I might not have taken notes on it, but I would listen. And I might even retain some of what I heard. And that's what I want to do. It's what I want to do in all of my classes, but it's particularly what I want to do in the Western Civ class, which is make it entertaining, make it dynamic, make it something other than reading from my notes in a dreadful monotone that nobody is going to listen to and everybody is going to. That's my Eeyore voice, by the way, Catherine.
Spot on. Yeah, spot on.
And you know, and I was never a theater major, but I did a lot of theater work as an undergraduate, and I draw on that. There is clearly a performative aspect, and that's where the methodological point comes in. The philosophy explains why I think it matters and why I'm so passionate about it. And the methodological point has to do with the delivery. You know, if I'm really passionate about this, I should damn well act like I'm passionate about this, eh? You know, and that means I don't read my notes in a dreadful monotone. It means that I will stomp around and I will yell, and there will be modulation in the voice. And, you know, you have only to go to the Rate My Professor evaluations to find out that I do yell a lot. You'll also find out the real reasons for my popularity, which are I don't have an attendance policy and I'm slack about due dates. But that's beside the point.
Okay.
No,
you're speaking students' language.
Yeah. Okay, next question.
All right,
so let me. That I've answered that one sufficiently. We can keep on with that.
I think so. I've got some notes, and yeah, we can talk about that again. But yeah, no, that touches on really the engagement aspect of teaching, and what's your pedagogical approach to what teaching is, and it's really engagement. And if you can make students engaged and interested, yeah, you've got them. You've got their interest, and it does start from the top down that way. I think that's a huge aspect of it. So yeah, thanks for sharing that philosophy.
My mother employed a similar aspect in her Brit Lit classes, and I also was kind of raised as a small child on campus. She used to, when I was small, she taught at Judson here in Alabama, and so I grew up taking Brit Lit classes with the with all the other girls at Judson. So preschool and kindergarten were a bit of a shock for me because I was already used to a collegiate classroom. But she did the same thing. Like I enjoyed sitting in watching my mom teach British Lit because she was so animated in how she told the story, and for me it was just entertaining story time. So I also took the history, the intro level history classes here at UA when I was an undergrad. I was a pre-major studies. I was one of those students that knew I wanted a degree, but I had no clue what I wanted to focus my energy on. And so
bingo.
I was actually really excited to take the history classes because I thought, well, I've always kind of liked it, but is this something that I really want to pursue? And it really enjoyed the Western Civ. I think I would have immensely enjoyed your version of Western Civ. But yeah, pre-major studies were was where I started. And it wasn't until I was a second semester sophomore that I decided that I wanted to major in anthropology. And that was after taking a very wide variety of classes to try to figure out what I wanted to really to study and what I most likely would want to turn into some kind of career or some kind of profession. So I think that's a fantastic approach to history, and I love that your goal in teaching that introductory level class is to reach all the majors, reach all the students who are not who either definitely know they are not inclined to history or maybe have not realized that they are or are not inclined to history. And I think that's brilliant, and I think that's a wonderful approach, and I commend you for that, John. That's fantastic.
Well, and probably this is more true in my upper level classes, but it's probably true in Western Civ as well. The really outstanding students probably chafe, because I pitch my lectures at the B and C students. There's some who I'm never going to reach because they need to grow up before they go. It's not a matter of smarts. Everybody in that class is smart enough to pass Western Civ, but some people aren't going to pass it because they just lack the motivation. They're not going to learn the material. They're not going to come to class, yada, yada, yada. I'm never going to reach them. They need to grow up. but I can reach the B and C students. And the A students are probably, the A students can get it. The A students don't need me. The A students are going to do the readings. The A students are going to figure this stuff out. They don't need me. The B and C students, yeah. And if it's entertaining, I might just reach them, or I might just reach some of them at any rate.
All right, Dr. Beeler, I'm going to transition just a little bit. Then I want to get to a viewer comment, a viewer question. So talking specifically about British naval history and its relationship to the history of the United States, specifically the 19th century, which is kind of what we're on topic about. So you have the War of 1812, and you have the impressment of American sailors and servicemen. And then, so I want to talk about this for a second. And then what is the policy of the British during the Civil War? Because I know you have some conflicting interests there. And I know that that's a huge question, a lot of material to unpack. But if you could touch on just those two subjects, the War of 1812 and then the U.S. Civil War. What is the policy decision going on there?
Absolutely. The Royal Navy has a massive manpower issue during the French Revolutionary, and particularly during the Napoleonic Wars. There is a limited pool of men with deep sea sailing experience. And they're competing with the merchant marine, which in wartime, because of the risks of sailing, because of blockades, because of the risk of privateers, merchant ship wages always go up substantially in wartime. And not surprisingly, deep sea sailors are more attracted to the merchant service because it pays higher wages. It doesn't have enough food or as much food, but the discipline is probably a little bit easier and the pay is a lot better. And so the Royal Navy resorts to this policy called impressment, which is a legalized form of kidnapping. It empowers the Royal Navy to round up men for service on Royal Navy ships. And it's not indiscriminate. Occasionally they get a guy occasionally they sweep up a respectable guy, although since they're operating only in waterfront districts, you have to ask yourself, what is a respectable guy doing in a waterfront district? Probably something related to partying or sex. They only want deep sea sailors because those are the guys who really have the skills that they require. And the easiest way to get deep sea sailors is not to sweep the land, but to stop vessels as they're coming into port, or to stop vessels on the high seas, because that's a good place to find deep water sailors. And also, the British don't recognize naturalization. If you were born a British citizen, you remain a British citizen in the eyes of British law. And also, Americans sound a lot like Brits. The differences in accent in the late 18th and early 19th century are a lot less pronounced than they are today. And so you go on board an American merchant ship and you say, okay, what's your nationality? Nobody's carrying a passport. You sound British to me. I'm going to go ahead and take you. Well, they do this often enough that it becomes a really, really sore point with the United States. And there are continual complaints about this. And it's actually used as one of the casus belli, one of the reasons for war in 1812. It's near the top of the list, if not outright at the top of the list. It cloaks ulterior motives because the United States is really interested in invading Canada. And James Madison is really interested in holding his party together, and what better way to cause unity than a patriotic war against the British, yada, 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 and all that. And so recent historiography has basically said, well, that business about impressment is really a red herring. You can use it as the casus belli, you can use the blockade, you can use what are called the orders and councils, the casus belli, but it's really not about that. Okay, and anybody who wants to go further with this on the subject with me is welcome to email me and ask me about it. But let's flash forward to the American Civil War. And the shoe is on the other foot with the American Civil War, because the Americans were upset with the British blockade, which was impeding commerce with the continent of Europe. And the Americans held that a neutral ship should be able to sail through the blockade as long as it's not carrying contraband of war. That's illegal. But it should be able to sail through the blockade, that the neutral flag covers the goods in the ship. And even if there are enemy goods in the ship, they can't be confiscated because they're under a neutral flag. The flag covers the goods. In the American Civil War, the shoe is on the other foot because, of course, the American government imposes a blockade of the southern states, the so-called Confederacy. And the British are the prime neutral carriers, and the British start to do this, well, the flag covers the goods business back on the United States. And the United States says, no, it doesn't. And so it depends on whether you're a belligerent or a neutral. All of a sudden, the United States is the one who is extending belligerent rights about search and seizure, and the British are the aggrieved party about this extension of belligerent rights, or belligerent power might be a more appropriate word for it. But at any rate, Milne, who's in command of the North American West Indies Station at this point, is asked by the British government, you need to dispatch your ships and survey the work of the blockade, because you can't just declare a paper blockade. You can't say, oh, the southern coastline is blockaded. You've actually got to have a physical presence of ships blockading for it to be regarded as legitimate, because if it's not regarded as legitimate, the British are going to say, we don't regard that as legitimate. We're going to go sailing through it, and we're going to use our warships to defend our neutral rights. And there's a big international crisis there. And so the British don't want to go to war. They don't have a dog in this fight, as it were. In fact, there's considerable sympathy in Britain, particularly amongst political elites, with the Confederacy. So they don't want to go to war, but neither are they going to acquiesce to a paper blockade. And so Milne gets asked, survey the blockade. Is it actually there? Is it actually effective? And the answers are yes and no. It's actually there. It's not actually all that effective. If you look at the number of blockade runners which try to run the blockade, something like 2/3 of them over the course of the war managed to get through. So you can't actually say that the blockade in a physical sense is effective. Now, does it shut down a lot of Southern commerce? Yeah, it damn well does. And it's effective in that sense, but that's another story. And Milne reports back, well, they've got ships stationed off all of the major ports, so let's regard the blockade as real. And therefore, the British declare neutrality, and the British tell their merchants in a proclamation by Queen Victoria, we need to observe the legitimacy of this blockade. In other words, don't try and break the blockade, which of course doesn't deter them at all. And in most of the blockade runners until very late in the war are British flagships. Some of them are American owned and they've transferred to the British flag. And most of the crews are British, and virtually all of the captains are British as well. And this is a source of real friction between the British and the American governments. And in that context, Milne is the perfect person to have in charge of the North American West Indies Station, because he's tactful, he's diplomatic, he's really, really good at pouring oil on troubled waters. And he's also sympathetic to the North. Unlike most British political elites, he sides pretty clearly with the North. Most of his subordinates are Southern sympathizers. In fact, he has to issue an order at one point that his captains are not to allow their crews to sing Dixie when they're in a harbor of the United States, because it is provocative. He's that kind of guy.
Was it based on like economic reasons? Is that why they were more Southern sympathizers? Is that why they were doing it, or for other social reasons?
They're two. One of them is a social reason. They mistakenly identify with the Southern planters, thinking that those guys are the equivalent, the aristocratic equivalent of the elites in England, and so they'd much rather have a landed elite like the Southern planters than those money-grubbing Yankee entrepreneurs,
Gotcha.
commercial factory owners.
Gotcha.
That's the social reason. And there is a more pragmatic political reason. They are worried about the rising economic strength of the United States as a future competitor. And if the United States is fragmented, broken up, it will provide less competition.
Hmm.
And that's the pragmatic political reason.
Is there also, John, if I can just ask real quick, because I do know we have a visitor comment that I'd like
Yeah.
for you to address. During Victorian England, when wasn't there a divide in the country of England itself between the the northern counties that were the industrial, like that's where all the industry and the factories and the
Yeah.
textiles and all of that was being produced in that area, and there was a very clear dividing line between that area of industrialized England and then the southern part of England that seemed to be a little bit more I guess laid back is a good way to
Rural and
describe it.
agricultural.
Yes, that's perfect.
Outside
Thank
of
you.
London, rural
Yes.
and agricultural.
Because I'm
Yeah.
thinking about the popular North and South book and miniseries that the BBC did that Richard Armitage stars in, and I'm a
Yeah.
personal fan. I think he is wonderful.
Yeah.
But it takes place during that exact same time. So did the British did that kind of play into their like, do you think they saw a little bit of a mirror of themselves in that division between the North and South that was happening in England, between the industrial North and the more agricultural South, mirrored in what was happening in the United States during the time of the Civil War? Because this is still Victorian time, the time period. So do you think there's a correlation there?
That division is real, and it's on the surface, it's very paradoxical. The northern industrial heartland, from Birmingham's in the Midlands, but we're thinking mostly about the cotton producing areas. Liverpool is the chief cotton port, Manchester, and this whole constellation of towns around Manchester in southern Lancashire. They are badly hurt by the Civil War because they are dependent on imported cotton, almost all of which is slave grown in the American South. And that's where the real effect of the blockade comes in. It's easy to run the blockade if you're in a fast ship with big engines, but fast ships with big engines can't hold much cargo. And moreover, and more importantly, the slow ships that can carry a lot of cotton don't try to run the blockade. So you see this dramatic, precipitous drop in cotton exports from the American South, which has really catastrophic consequences ultimately for the Southern economy, mega inflation and things like that. But it also cuts off Cottonopolis, Manchester, from its chief source of cotton. And in England, they refer to a cotton famine. And the industrial workers in the north of England side almost uniformly with the North. Why? Because they are opponents of slavery, and they know what that fight is really about. And so if you look at the cotton workers in Manchester, they put up a statue to Abraham Lincoln in Manchester because he is that important. The Emancipation Proclamation is that important to those industrial workers. And in the south of England, the sympathies, more rural and more agricultural, London accepted, the sympathies are more largely not with the enslaved, but with the owners of the enslaved. And so, yeah, there is a clear north-south divide, but you would think that the people whose livelihoods are genuinely being hurt by the Civil War and by the blockade would be sympathetic to the South, and they're not.
That's fascinating. Yeah, no, I would love to do a deep dive into that conversation. That'd be a lot of fun. Okay, so we have to get to a viewer comment. Katherine, would you like to read it because it's on your site, or I'm happy to do it?
Yes, let me
Okay.
give me a moment to click over. So this is from Ronald Howard, and Ronald says, as a naval historian, have you done any research on Dr. Algernon Sidney Garnett, who, among other accomplishments, served as a surgeon on the CCS Virginia during the famous Battle of the Monitor and the Merrimack? After the war, he served as the chair of physiology and hygiene at the University of Alabama. Uh, Ron says, my wife and I donated a collection of original letters from his wife, which were written during their tenure at the university. Some are quite amusing. We did research on Dr. Garnett and provided this information to UA Special Collections along with the letters. So, John, have you done any research on Dr. Algernon
No,
Garnett?
and this is where I like to tell my students. I teach a class on the history of the United States Navy, and includes the Navy of the Confederacy, because my predecessor, Robert Irwin Johnson, Bowtie Bob, as he was known to his students because of his characteristic neckwear, just a wonderful human being. He was an American naval historian. He taught a course on U.S. naval history. He was retiring. This is why the University of Alabama wanted a naval historian, but that came with the territory, or it came with that stretch of ocean, to use a more nautical metaphor, that I had to teach U.S. naval history, which I knew very little about when I came to the University of Alabama. Fortunately for me, this is fairly finite. The American Navy didn't exist before the Continental Navy in 1775, and it's not like having to learn social or cultural history. So I took it on. I won't say I'm good at it, but I've taught it for a long time, so I should at least be competent at it. But as far as my research goes, I'm a British naval historian, as I'm fond of telling my students in U.S. naval history. Whenever they ask me a question which I can't answer, which happens a lot, I can always just go, this is my excuse, I'm a British historian. I'm a British naval historian. I do know that one of Raphael Semmes's subordinates, I'm not sure which one it was after the war, wrote in a letter basically what an idiotic thing we were fighting for slavery. I look back on that with considerable regret, and I'm going, oh yeah, somebody figured it out, like Longstreet. You figured it out. No, the short answer is no. I've not done any specific research on any American naval figure in American naval history or Confederate naval history. What I know basically comes from Milne's interactions, and the interactions are almost entirely with the United States government and United States naval officers. Britain doesn't recognize the Confederacy as a legitimate government.
All right, we're kind of close down to time. I have about a dozen questions, and then everything else I've just written down that we could continue talking about for several hours at this point. So I'm going to touch on two real quick.
If you run out of people to talk to, further on down the line, we can pick up where we left off. That's no problem at all.
I will just might take you up on that. This has been a lot of fun.
Consider yourself booked, John. You just booked yourself.
Pencil you in for that date. All right. Yeah, maybe we can even get Dr. Sharony Green on here at the same time. We could talk to both of you together. That would be a really fun conversation. Okay, so two questions I want to touch on, and Katherine, throw one in here too if you like. But okay, Patrick O'Brien and Master and Commander, or C.S. Forrester and the Horatio Hornblower series. You got to pick which one and why.
C.S. Forrester, for my money, is a better writer. O'Brien never wrote African Queen, by the way. Forrester did. And second of all, it is the prejudice based on the first one I was exposed to. O'Brien's novels didn't exist when I was growing up. I read the Hornblower series, and so nothing else. Dudley Pope doesn't measure up. Alexander Kent doesn't measure up. Patrick O'Brien doesn't measure up. Nobody else who has written nautical novels set in the Age of Sail about the Royal Navy measures up to the Hornblower series in C.S. Forrester.
Okay, I need to watch I think there was a TV series in like 99 2000 on Horatio Hornblower. I haven't seen that. I've seen the Russell Crowe Master and Commander, which is a great film. I think it's relatively accurate.
It is a great film, although the naval historian in me can pick at it almost endlessly. Everything that gets dramatized by Hollywood, you begin to go, well, if you actually took the rear wheels off your cannon carriage in order to elevate your cannon, you would be creating severe problems for your deck when you fired those cannon.
That could be a fun series where we just watch movies with our experts and you just critique them as we talk to them, as we watch them. That would be a lot of fun.
The University of Alabama History Club did that. They had a screening for the Master and Commander movie for the students, anybody who wanted to show up, and then they had me providing commentary and answering questions afterwards.
Cool.
That is fun.
So it is a good idea. Somebody beat you to it, but it is a good idea.
All right, we'll have to come up with an entire new list of movies and films then. I'm going to explore that a little bit. But yeah, Catherine, do you have a question?
Well, I was just gonna say I really don't have a dog in this fight. Probably the only nautically based book that I read whenever I was young, because I have to admit I did read a lot, is The True Confessions of Charlotte Doyle, and that's pretty much the extent of my knowledge on any kind of nautical novel or anything like that. I spent time on the coast as a child, but it was the summer vacation, spot every once in a while. I was not as close to it as both of you were on the coast of North Carolina. So I really don't really have much of a dog in this fight, but I am ashamedly a fan of the first Pirates of the Caribbean. After that, I think the story just gets a little bit too fantastic, and quite frankly, I can't even follow it. Couldn't tell you what happens at the end of the series. I think they lost it somewhere, but yeah. Other than The True Confessions of Charlotte Doyle, that's pretty much the only nautical experience. Literary experience I have.
That is, at the heart of where naval history is going right now, because it is going in a more social direction. We want to know more. We know plenty about the lives of the officers. We know plenty about the Alexander Milnes because they left this vast paper trail. But the ordinary sailors usually left no paper trail. How do you do a social history? Well, we have all sorts of evidence in the form of muster books, in the form of surgeons' reports, in the form, this data that the Admiralty collected. And we also are becoming more acutely aware that this was not a homosocial space. This wasn't all guys. There were women involved in this too. Some of them who dressed up like men and actually behaved as men outwardly. But anytime a vessel was in port, be it a merchant vessel or a warship, there were women around it. There were women on board of it. The officers could flout Admiralty regulations and take their wives and sometimes their children to sea with them. Alexander Milnes' dad did this. But even amongst the enlisted personnel, there were a handful of women aboard when vessels went to sea, usually married to senior petty officers, usually married to, to the bosun or the carpenter. And these women performed nursing duties. These women performed cooking duties. There was a gendered work, component to this as well. But there were women present, and we have barely begun to scratch the surface of that story of the Navy social history. And we've not really scratched the surface of the women who were married to these men who didn't go off to sea with them, who had to make some sort who had to put food on the table, who had to keep a roof over their heads for them and their children. And we're going in this direction, but there's a great deal more to be done.
Okay, we are just about out of time, but I want to touch on this one last viewer question, and we can do it in like a 20-second answer if that's possible. So Pato69 asks, was Admiral Halsey ultimately successful in his quest to obtain a berth to get to sea?
I'm going to plead ignorance as a British historian here, because Bull Halsey is an American admiral. Yeah.
Okay. So individual research is required, and we'll leave it at that then. So, well, Dr. Beeler, this has been a lot of fun. This has been a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on and talking with us.
Okay. Well, I've had a great time with it too. And again, if you need. If you're short of talent, then you can get this talentless individual on again. Okay.
Fair enough. Duly taken.
You all take care. I've had a lot of fun.
Thank you.
All right.
John.
All right, well, I think that's going to do it for this Museums from Your Home live stream. Just so that everybody knows, we've changed our live stream schedule a little bit due to some big virtual summer events like Museum Expedition and Bama Bugfest. So the next Museums from Your Home live stream is going to be on Monday at Mountainville Archaeological Park's Facebook page, as well as the UA Museums YouTube channel, which you can find at youtube.com/UA Museums. You can find all of the information about Museums from Your Home that you might need at museums.ua.edu/museums from your home. So if you have any questions about the live stream schedule, or if you want to see past archived live streams, you can check them out there. And any additional educational content that you might need, you can find there. And if you would like to support UA Museums and everything that we're doing right now, you can go to give.ua.edu/museums, and that will allow you the chance to become a supporting member of UA Museums, and we would love for you to consider doing that. Well, I just want to thank everybody who was watching today, and to everyone who will watch this in the future, and thank you for visiting UA Museums from your home. All right, well, hope everybody has a great Wednesday, and we'll talk to y'all later.
Thanks again.
Had fun. Bye-bye.